Now, adjustment layers in Photoshop are super flexible and they're super valuable. In the layers palette on the bottom, you have the little sort of black and white yin-yang half circle dealio. If you mouse over that, it says create new fill or adjustment layer. Now, clicking on this once, you get a little drop down of all these different adjustment layers. And the first one, you have solid color, gradient, and pattern. Now, these are actually called fill layers that are under the adjustment layer because they fill the entire screen or the entire image with like a solid color or gradient or a pattern. And just to show an example of that really quick, do solid color. And what that allows you to do is select a color and it fills the entire image with a solid color. Now, this has various uses that I use throughout the DVD or throughout this tutorial, and I find it pretty helpful in a lot of cases. This also can be isolated to a selection or a mask. So in the side here, you have your mask where your selection would be, or you can just go ahead and paint something in, and you can see that that will mask out the color. Or if you grab a selection and then do a solid color, you'll see that it fills your selection with the solid color. So that is a color fill. Now we're going to move on to the gradient. And the gradient, we went over the gradient editor and how gradients work. And basically this allows you to fill the entire image with a gradient or a selection or mask it out. And this works just like any other gradient that we've used before. Now, the beauty about the adjustment layer is that it's always there, and you could always turn it on and off, and you could always edit it at any time. So that's the great thing about adjustment layers. So that's pretty much the gradient. We've gone over that before. So let's just move on to the next one, which is pattern. And again, it's an adjustment layer that brings up your pattern fill and gives you all the presets or your own custom patterns that you've put in before, and allows you to fill that layer. And then once it's a layer, you can go ahead and use all your different transparency layers, your opacity, and all that. And you could see that right away using some patterns. You could kind of dirty up an image or whatever. So the rest of the adjustment layers we're going to talk about are all Adobe Photoshop color correction and color adjustment tools. And we'll go through each one of these one by one and give you just a brief overview of what each one does. And then that pretty much correlates to the same tools that are under Image, Adjust, and your color correction tools. Now there's a little more in here that we're going to go over too, but for the most part all the adjustment layers are the same ones that are under the layer adjustment menu. Now again, to add an adjustment layer, you could click on your adjustment layer icon and you could do brightness contrast. Now with every adjustment layer has your adjustments palette now, or panel, that is associated with the adjustment layer. And it gives you the controls for that particular adjustment layer, and then it also has some icons at the bottom. Now for brightness contrast, you have your brightness, you have your contrast. Now Use Legacy has to deal with the engine of the adjustment brightness contrast within Photoshop. And with Photoshop CS4 and CS5, they sort of changed how the adjustment layers work a little bit. And so the Use Legacy actually will give you a different result in the brightness and contrast than previous versions. So if we look at our brightness now, and we use our slider, you can see that pretty much the intensity is changing. And it's within sort of relative color space of your image. Now if we go and we do Use Legacy, and we'll drag our slider, as you can see our image gets kind of washed out. And what's actually happening here is that Photoshop is adding white to all the pixels to increase its brightness. So not the most ideal way to do brightness and contrast, but again, if you turn that off, you can see that it gives you a much better result of using brightness here. And same with contrast. Contrast sort of keeps it all relative to the image that you're working on and the color space that it's using. And in Legacy, instead of using white like the brightness, it uses black and fills in black to create your contrast. So as you can see, it can kind of do some funky things to your image, which is, actually kind of cool in some respects, but that's pretty much the brightness and contrast adjustment layer with the used legacy. Now, I'm going to turn that off and move on from there. At the bottom, this adjustment palette or panel has all these new little controls down here. One of which returns to the adjustment list, and I'll get to that in 1 second. So if we click this other one, basically it expands the adjustment palettes and makes it a little more easier to work with. It's a little larger. But going back to the adjustment list, if we click on that, you can see that here's our list of adjustment layers. We have, brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure, etc. And then Photoshop also gives you these presets. Now when you click on these, or any of these, you'll see that in your layers palette, all of these you'll just create a new adjustment layer. So you see that we just created levels. That's right there. And if we go back, we just created curves, so on and so forth. But then there's also presets where, say you're just looking to do something really fast and you just open up your presets and you just want to increase the contrast and call it a day. So as you can see, we just hit that increase contrast. It popped up a new levels that had some settings that were already set to increase the contrast. And here's our other adjustment layers. Now if we don't like those, we could just go ahead and kill them and just work with the one. So adjustment layers are now a little more powerful. There's another workflow for them, which is all through this adjustment list palette. And there's also visibility or reset to the defaults, and you could throw it away. And then we have our clipping layer, which is basically our effect. We'll clip to the transparent pixels on the layer below. So that's pretty much the adjustment layers of workflow and how they work. So you can either add them down here, or you can go to the adjustment list and add them here, or go ahead and add some presets. So let's take a look at levels. We took a look at brightness, contrast. Let's look at levels really quick. And again, here's our adjustment list rollout. Now, the levels, we have our presets here. We have our channels, so you could adjust the levels of all of your channels combined, red, green, and blue. And there's this auto button, which auto is kind of, Photoshop analyzing your image and analyzing the histogram and kind of figuring out, where do you need the correction? Is it in the shadows? Is it in your gamma, or is it in your highlights? And kind of figures that out by itself. If you don't like it, hit the reset. Sometimes your auto works just fine. Sometimes it gives you a result that you're not really happy with. So again, that's up to you to figure that out. And you have your eyedroppers, where you can eyedrop parts of your image and go from there to dial things in. Now, you also have your calculate. There's a button that calculates a better histogram, which kind of disappeared once I clicked it. But it just, again, Photoshop analyzes your image to give you the most accurate histogram, which is what you're looking at right here. Now here, on this stop, you have a, this would be like your shadows or your darks. So dragging that to the right will make your image darker. And it also shifts your gamma towards the white. So your gamma is your midtones. And as you can see, shifting that around changes your midtones, getting darker, brighter, and then your highlights or your whites. So dragging that in will increase your brightness and your contrast. Now there's also numeric values you could type in, if you just want to clamp your darks, bring them in. You could type numbers into these input fields. And then there's also the output levels, which is the output of your image. So if you don't really want a lot of black in your image, or you want to control how much black is outputting, go ahead and drag that in. You can see that it's removing black from your image. And then on the opposite end, the white. If you want to reduce the amount of white that's going into your image, then you could bring that in. So there's just a lot of different controls, which essentially are like brightness and contrast and your levels, to dial in the color correction and sort of your contrast. I use levels quite a bit, and that's pretty much it for the levels. Now next is curves. I'm going to go ahead and click curves here and make a curves adjustment layer. And curves sort of works like levels, but it gives you a little more fidelity as far as how to control those levels. And it does that by displaying a curve and allows you to edit this curve. So again, at the bottom you have your output. So if you shift this along the bottom, you'll see that it's sort of doing the same thing that levels is doing. You move it and then it's making things darker. You have your brightness input, and then you have at the top here you have some different presets. You have your RGB, your channels, your auto, and then there's also a tool where you can click in the image and adjust the curve. Right now I have my preferences set up to auto collapse this palette, so I'm going to go and change that really quick. And that's an interface, I believe, which is auto collapse iconic panels, auto show hidden panels kind of thing. So I'm going to hit OK, click on that, and now I should be able to edit my image, and you can see that the curve is adjusting in real time while I'm clicking on the image. Now with the curves, you have your little crosshair here and your pencil. You could click along this and add points for you to sort of edit the curve. I'm running your mouse over these points, you get a little directional arrow tool or icon. And you can see that you can isolate a section of the image or a section of your black or your color, and you could adjust it there. And you can see how you could have some fine control over your image and how that's working. And again, this is just color correction, and it's allowing you to give some fine control over the contrast, your darks and highlights in your image. After curves, you have exposure. And exposure works similar to levels, but it's based off of photography exposure. So if we click our exposure and drag it up, you can see our exposure gets very bright or very dark. Your offset, which again is kind of your midtones and your gamma. And then like a gamma correction, so on and so forth. Moving on, we have vibrance. And vibrance is pretty cool. What that allows you to do is sort of punch up your colors. So your saturation will really push the saturation of your colors, while the vibrance kind of pushes the intensity, while also keeping it the same value. Next we have hue saturation. Again, you could do a hue shift, saturation, you could desaturate your image, your lightness, which is adding white or adding black, and then there's your colorize. Now with colorize click, you can go ahead and choose the hue that you want. Under your drop down, you have your master, you have your reds, and you can isolate colors in your images to just your reds, and you say if you want to shift them towards a different color, purple, whatever, you can do that. You can do that with yellow, so on and so forth through your image. And that's pretty much it for the hue saturation. Now again, moving on, we have our color balance, and you have your shadows, midtones, highlights. And again, here you could sort of tint or tone your shadows by dragging it towards red. You get red. Towards cyan, you get cyan. Same exact thing for your midtones. And your highlights. Again, pretty powerful stuff here in Photoshop for color correcting. You have your preserve luminosity, and that just means that as you shift these, the red will start to bleed into other aspects of your image, changing the luminosity. So keeping that on will keep sort of the same intensity of your image. Moving on, we've got your black and white. And this will allow you to sort of dial in your different color ranges, but keep them into in black and white. And so you can push and pull your values, your grayscale values. And again, there's some presets for you. And what's happening here is we have so many adjustment layers that it's starting to kind of blow up a little bit. So let's go ahead and remove these. I'm going to reset them all. Get rid of my pattern fill, and I'm going to go put the black and white back on. And so what's happening here influences the reds in the resulting black and white image. So you're basically dialing the intensity of your reds in the photograph, but while you're in the black and white color space. So you can kind of see how there's not a whole lot of green in this image, but how you can sort of push and pull different aspects of your image to dial in your black and white image, or your black and white result. And again, that's just an adjustment layer, so you could always turn it on and off. And I'm going to turn this one off and go back and move on to the photo filters, which I think are pretty cool, which sort of gives you a tint, but it affects the pixels and just adds a little bit of warmth or a little bit of coolness to your photograph, and it gives you your density and your color. So there's warming filters. So you can see this image now has warmth to it, or you have cooling filters, and you can see how it just got cooler. You can select the color and dial it in from there, and then there's your density, preserve luminosity, and there you go. Pretty cool. I use it a lot. Sometimes it just helps stylize image a little bit, and we're going to move on from there to the channel mixer. Now again, you have presets. Set it to default. I'm going to turn off my other adjustment layers. Your different channels, monochrome. Let's reset this here. And you could just sort of dial in your different RGB channels. Again, just more powerful tools in Photoshop for you to adjust your image. And there's no one tool that does everything, so it's just a mix and match and sort of a hodgepodge of different adjustment layers to get your end result. There's no real one tool that will do it. So it's just something to be mindful about when you're approaching a photograph and color correcting your photograph. Now that we've gone over a lot of these, and we'll continue, they're just, all these things can just help your image and your image quality and the look of your image a great deal. Now just invert, all this is going to do is invert your image. And posterize. Now, the part at the bottom where it's invert and posterize, threshold, etc., these are more like effects to some degree. Now, posterize kind of crunches down your gamut of your image and your colors and your color space. So obviously, like if you have 255 levels, that's the highest you can go, and you have all your channels and all your bits. As you move this down, you can see that your color space is reducing. And creating banding because it's sort of reducing your color depth. Threshold basically takes the contrast in your image and removes out all the color. And as you drag that down and drag it up, you can see what it's doing to your image. And you could use this in combination with, other layer styles to create an effect. You could also do, photographs and, create some interesting looking stylized photos using this technique. The gradient map, clicking on that and opening up your gradient editor, you can go ahead and sort of remap your colors with different gradients that are that you either design or that you can load up, unload to sort of stylize your image. But again, using this really quick, we can go ahead, put in some color stops, choose some colors from our swatches, and you can see what that's doing there. You can kind of mix and match, dial in some values to sort of stylize your image. And we go into this more in depth a little bit later. And basically you can see what the gradient map does. This allows you to remap your image with a gradient. Let's go back. We have our selective color. Last but not least, go ahead and add that. And I'm going to turn off my gradient map. So we have our selective color. And now again, we can just go ahead and go through our different color channels or different colors that are in our image. Push and pull them towards different colors that we're looking for. Your reds, your yellows, you can push them towards your cyan. Remove the green from them. If there's any green, not a whole lot of green in this image. Blues. You can see how we're making this a little more blue rather than purple there. Magenta. Start pulling out some of the magenta color. Add in a little bit of yellow. You can do your whites, neutrals, and blacks. And there's relative and absolute. And that's just an interpolation of pixels and values within Photoshop. So looking at that, you could kind of see how we pushed it into like a color palette almost just by using that, which is kind of cool. But that's pretty much it for the adjustment layers. And again, super powerful, and you can really use it to dial in your images, color correct your photos, and whether it be artwork or photograph or whatever it is that you bring into Photoshop, and control it. And it's non-destructive, which is the beauty. You could layer these up as much as you want and go from there. I mean, you're not ruining your original image. It's always intact. So that's pretty much it for layer styles.